Warm welcome to all of you. This is Dr. Manisha Mirtha, and today we would be speaking on deliberative democracy part 2. We have already spoken about this topic in part 1, where we gained understanding of what this concept means. Let us go on further with the understanding of this concept. So, we have already said that this kind of democracy seeks to address some of the shortcomings of the traditional representative democracy, because this democracy or this model of democracy fosters meaningful citizen participation, inclusive decision making, and something which promotes common good. So, deliberative democracy is a process where citizens exchange arguments and consider different claims that are designed to secure the public good. Through this conversation, citizens can come to an agreement about what procedure, action or policy will best produce the public good. Now, let us try to understand this democracy through a hypothetical case study. So, I have here with me a case study which we will try to understand, and how deliberation occurs in democracy ideally. This case study will help us understand the concept in elaboration. So, let us go on with this. Let us assume that there is a problem of global warming, and let us create a hypothetical country called the Ecoland. Now, Ecoland is a country which is facing problems of global warming and climate change. Ecoland is also a country which is progressive in its approach and is aiming to deal with this problem. So, what would a deliberative democracy in this country do to tackle this problem? Let us try to understand this case study through these pointers which are seen on the screen. So, introduction is what deliberative democracy is, and we have said that this is an inclusive citizen participation. Now, the problem was of global warming, and certain policy decisions had to be taken to deal with this problem. Now, how does this country that we are calling Ecoland engages into a deliberation to deal with this problem? So, the first thing which the country needs to do is make a committee, a kind of a committee which would deal with this problem. So, let us assume that assembly has been created, and we have titled it as Citizens Assembly on Climate Change. So, this kind of a committee has been created, and the composition of the assembly necessarily should be a heterogeneous mix, a balance of mix of people of all sections of the society with varied interest. So, that is how the committee will be created, and then once the committee is created, then the deliberation process will start. Now, what happens in this entire deliberation that we have been talking about, if practically we had to understand this? So, at the outset there will be a learning phase, which basically means that all the members of the assembly or committee that has been created by Ecoland will be given all the necessary information which is required to deal with this problem. As we said that this is something on global warming, the problem is on global warming and climate change. So, all the information on the science of climate change is something which would be given to the members. So, what causes can be there for this kind of a problem, or what policy implications can be there of this kind of a problem, is something which will be made available to all the members who form the committee. So, next is the deliberation process. Now, in this process, the information will be given to all the members. Say for example, all the information on the science of climate change, what comprehensive education which can be given to all the policy options available, and the various potential impacts that this problem can lead to, is something which will be informed to the members of the assembly that has been created. So, once this learning phase where all the necessary information is given to them, then would start the deliberative phase, where members or the participants of the entire assembly will get together and discuss the entire narrative of that. So, what their views are on this problem is something which will be discussed based on the knowledge which has been given to them in the learning phase. after the deliberation process, there will be a proposal process where the members of the committee will then propose what they offer, what solutions they have to offer to this problem. And once this is given, then the presentation phase would be there, where they will be actually presenting their ideas in front of a forum. So, this is about deliberation, and then the outcome would be where information has been disseminated, information decision making will be taken care of, there will be policy recommendations, policy engagement, and eventually the governmental response, where the government now takes the proposals given by this assembly seriously and aligns them with the policy proposals or the policy implications. So, therefore, we could say that a problem like global warming, which was affecting the climate, was something which was addressed by a progressive country like Ecoland. A committee was created to deliberate on that topic. There were various policy options which were proposed, and eventually an outcome was suggested to the government, which was accepted, and accordingly a policy decision was taken. So, this is something which we actually mean by the deliberative democracy that we have been talking about, and possibly this case study helps us understand the process better. However, we also have to understand that this deliberative democracy that we have been talking about has its own fair share of limitations. Deliberation is a necessary precondition for the legitimacy of democratic political decisions. Let us also look into the general criticisms of this kind of democracy. One of the criticisms is that the public support for deliberative democracy is weak or inconsistent, and many electorates explicitly favor political leaders who disparage deliberation. So, this is the irony of democracies, that though we live in democracies, but people or the electorate generally prefer leaders who depreciate deliberation. They want leaders who will take decisions on their behalf. So, that can be a limitation of this kind of a democracy. Another one, that people are psychologically incapable of the kinds of reasoning required to deliberate. For example, being able to recognize and critically assess their own motivations. So, sometimes there is this lacuna of the people's ability themselves. They feel incapacitated to deliberate and discuss, and to be able to critically analyze their own suggestions and their motivations. Another criticism can be that deliberation has been overwhelmed by mass media and social media, which favor misinformation, propaganda, and outrage. So, a lot of trivia is also available for comprehension if people pay heed to, but that is something which has to be ignored by the members of the deliberation, because they can be easily swayed by that. So, deliberation process can be influenced by media, both mass and social, which can lead to misinformation. So, that has to be taken care of. Formal bodies that claim to be deliberative are always hypocritical about it. So, for instance, legislatures are sites of power that merely pretend to deliberate. So, sometimes a kind of a facade is created. People get together with the purpose of deliberation, but deliberation is only a pretense. Things have already been decided, and this seems to be a forum to fashion out their own needs and desires. Deliberation implies a kind of calm, rational discourse that is biased in favor of some cultures and social classes, or is simply unhelpful when people are suffering. So, again, another problem of deliberative democracy is that people come with their own mindsets, people come with their own schemas about cultures, about specific social classes, which is very unhelpful in dealing with the problem of democracies. Another criticism could be that actual deliberations are systematically unequal because of characteristics such as gender and race that people bring with them into the room. Again, there is a kind of a systematic discrimination which happens in these deliberations. It is supposed to be comprising of people who belong to the same social standard, but hierarchies have already been created, and that incapacitates deliberations which happen in the meetings. People who deliberate with diverse peers are less likely to take political action, probably because the conversation reduces their confidence and sense of certainty. So, there is a problem with some people that when they are put in a very heterogeneous, diversified group, then they are not honestly able to opine so freely as they would have done if they were with their own peers. So, that becomes a problem with deliberative democracy. Conversations go better when people who share common experiences can talk amongst themselves. That is especially true for marginalized or oppressed people. Pulling them into one deliberation with powerful people generally suppresses their voice. So, this looks like a forced deliberation. The kind of deliberation that you would require from these people and how their views are valued is something which actually does not come out in open. The entire deliberation process is something which is defeated through this kind of a problem. Another criticism could be that deliberative democracy event set up a contrast with regular democratic processes such as elections that makes the latter look bad. Sometimes we have a very utopian idea of this deliberative democracy, and when people are completely captured by this vision, then to them the other forms or the other mechanisms of democracy, which is something like adult franchise or voting, looks bad, which again is not conducive to the idea of deliberative democracy. There is no plausible theory of change for making scattered small scale deliberative experiments important in a society as a whole. So, Albert Zohr has asked, who will spark public deliberation? Where will it take place? And how will the strong counter deliberative forces in political life be kept at bay? So, these are some rhetorical questions which are essentially important to the deliberations which take place, because they can really hamper the kind of discussions which will take place in that forum. Now, a large body of literature has sought to understand why democracy has thrived in the Indian context. Till now, we have spoken of what deliberative democracy means, and we had tried to gain understanding through a case study and dealt with the criticisms. Let us now try to understand how deliberative democracy happens in India. India is a country and the kind of democracy which is here is open to a lot of debate. The elections are hotly contested, though well conducted, and a lot of other problems which happen with Indian democracy. But at the same time, Indian democracy has been one of those democracies which has actually initiated the experiment on deliberative democracy. So, India is a resilient democracy, and a large body of literature has sought to understand why democracy has thrived in Indian context. One proposed and contested component of that explanation has been the long history of public reasoning and debate on the subcontinent, which says that an argumentative tradition that is intimately connected with the development of democracy. So, one of the answers to this question, as in why democracy has thrived in India, is that the kind of argumentative tradition which is required for deliberation is inherently there in the Indian democracy, and traces of this can be seen from the ancient times. So, if we draw largely from what John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas had said, who, as we said in the first PPT, that have been the torchbearers of this concept of deliberative democracy, and who see deliberation as rooted in equality, rationality, and the free exchange and weighting of ideas. Deliberation on this understanding is a mechanism for resolving reasonable differences within a pluralistic society. So, therefore, these theories emphasize three necessary preconditions or prerequisites for deliberation. First one being, parties in deliberation are formally and substantively equal. So, the first prerequisite is that all the engaging participants belong to the same footing. Second, deliberation is based on reason rather than coercion. That is, no force except that of better argument is exercised. So, whatever deliberations which happen are never forced, are never coercively forced, rather they happen out of will. And lastly, that the object of deliberation ought only to be common good rather than individual interest. So, they are trying to promote common good and no individual interest. So, these three conditions have been talked about as the necessary prerequisites for deliberative democracy. Now, interestingly, on the face of it, contemporary India lacks these conditions. At the same time, it boasts the most widely used deliberative institution in human history, the village assembly, which is known as the Gram Sabha, which was instituted in 1992 as a part of the 73rd Amendment of the Constitution, and now affects millions of lives of people living in villages in rural India. Now, these bodies are the most recent in the long tradition of deliberative institutions in India, which date back to the 5th century. How does India, with its deep social and economic inequalities and illiteracy and entrenched identity politics, sustain a robust deliberative democracy? This is a question which has intrigued a lot of political scholars and thinkers. And to answer this, while Indian electoral democracy, as we said, was instituted in its current form during independence, and the practice of public reasoning and deliberation is a much older tradition. So, the tradition of argumentation and deliberation is something which has been there much before independence. If I had to give examples, because we can trace them down in Buddhism, in Jainism, we can trace them down towards the reign of Ashoka or the Mughal dynasty. To give you a few examples, religious councils hosted by the early Indian Buddhists, for example, often focused on resolving debates within and across religious traditions. Importantly, they also addressed the demands of the social and civic duties, and furthermore helped in a general way to consolidate and promote the tradition of open discussion on contentious issues. So, it dates back then that the idea of deliberation was found during the time of Buddhism. It was also seen during, in fact, it was rather celebrated during the reign of Ashoka, who sought to codify rules for public discussions that emphasized mutual respect and honor. And it was also seen during the reign of Akbar that the interfaith dialogue were explicitly aimed at the pursuit of reason rather than complete reliance on tradition. The priority given to equality and reason in deliberation echoes standards in contemporary deliberative theory. Perhaps even more significantly, their explicit sponsorship by the state reveals the extent of their importance to early Indian culture. However, we also have to note that the deliberation that we were talking about of those ancient times was not confined to state sponsored discourse only. Instead, it was used as a vehicle to criticize the state. Even in this early period, participants in such public debates, which extended beyond the intellectual and the political and the religious elite, and the debates which were happening in sabhas and kathas, panchayats, samads, they included all kinds of people, the notable big men, the peasants, and people of all social economic strata, and in contestation with each other and in opposition to the state. Yet the dialogues and the deliberations were encouraged. Now, if we look of the deliberative democracy in India in dialogue with the West, of particular relevance of this entire trajectory of this kind of democracy in India can be traced back to Henry Maine, who was sent to India in 1860s to advise the British government on legal matters. So while serving in the subcontinent, he came across several accounts of British administrators of thriving indigenous systems of autonomous village governments whose structure and practice shared many characteristics of participatory democracy. So when he was sent to India, he found that traces of this kind of governance could be found in the villages of India. Plus, Maine was also influenced a lot by J.S. Mill, whom we have referred to previously and who was one of the major proponents of liberal democracy, and who had argued that universal suffrage and participation in a democratic nation would greatly benefit from the experience of such participation at the local level also. And observing Indian village governments, Maine came to articulate a theory of the village community as an alternative to the centralized state. Now, his description of self-reliant Indian village communities shaped the thinking of the father of a nation, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who made it a central tenet of his vision for an independent India. So, it was Gandhiji who talked about grassroots democracy. He was the one who talked about an egalitarian society. He was the one who actually initiated the idea of the panchayati system. Gandhi's philosophy of decentralized economic and political power, as articulated in his book Village Swaraj, views the self-reliant village as emblematic of a perfect democracy, ensuring equality across castes and religions and self-sufficiency in all needs. So, Gandhiji had vehemently proposed the idea of this kind of a democracy starting from the rural India. However, Gandhiji's proposal was defeated during the Constituent Assembly debates. Now, why was it defeated? So, Gandhiji, when he proposed his ideas of this egalitarian society, according to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was the father of the drafting committee of the Constitution, said that this idea, though very vibrant, would not be very successful in India. And the reason being that rural India was still quite largely defined by hierarchies. They were illiterate, and yet the hierarchies were strongly entrenched in the Indian culture, especially in the rural India. So, when this was there and rural India was suffering from these problems, then even the proper constitutional provisions would not be able to secure the rights of the people, and they would always be governed by the elite class. So, this kind of a democracy which Gandhiji had envisaged was something which would not be successful. So, therefore, his proposal was defeated during the debates. However, the idea of village democracy did not entirely disappear from the Indian Constitution. So, we had Article 40, which stated that the state shall take steps to organize village panchayats and endow them with such powers and authority as may be necessary to enable them to function as units of self-government. So, this principle, though, was only a directive principle and something which is a non-justiciable guiding post for policy. However, some state governments did set up a formally constituted village democracy, say for example Karnataka. Eventually, a movement to amend the Indian Constitution and to strengthen Article 40 came around, which resulted in 1992 in the passage of the 73rd constitutional amendment of the Indian Constitution, and which gave several important powers and functions to village government. A kind of a three-tier system of decentralization was created. Accompanying forum of deliberation, the Gram Sabha, was formally codified. And this creation mandated that all Indian villages would be governed by an executive, which would be the elected village council, and a legislature formed by the Gram Sabha, to which every citizen of the village would be a member, with meetings held at least 2 times a year. So, we can see that the idea of direct democracy was proposed over here and how it could be formalized. Also, the amendment required that at least 33% of seats in village councils would be reserved for women, and a number of proportionate to the population in the village reserved for disadvantaged castes. So, therefore, this did not simply talk about direct democracy, it also talked about the participation of women and the disadvantaged castes and classes. So, this was a change which was brought about for the rural India with large benefits. However, the sheer scale of deliberation practiced through the Indian Gram Sabha has been remarkable, not only because these forums are vibrant despite illiteracy and inequality, but because they have been a key site where citizens can challenge entrenched social hierarchies and demand improved governance from elected officials. So, this practice of rural India has been remarkable, because in spite of the problems of social inequalities and problems of illiteracy, a kind of a culture has been created which challenges the social hierarchies and demands improved governance from the elected officials. They are answerable to the people. By providing an open space for citizens, both men and women, high and low castes, to exercise voice, the Gram Sabha has served an important role in the Indian democratic experience. So, this experience in Indian democracy has actually led to a lot of praise in the entire world, and how in spite of the roadblocks that India faces, we have been able to come to a remarkable expression of deliberative democracy. There were various problems, there was hierarchical structures, there was illiteracy, there was downtrodden who were not able to understand the implications of deliberative democracy. In spite of that, we have been able to create a self-governing, self-sustaining, egalitarian society. Despite these successes, however, the empirical scholarship also provides evidence for the concerns articulated by Ambedkar. Both the challenges of rural illiteracy and that of elite domination and gender bias, something which was anticipated decades back by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, has also turned out to be true. The deliberative democracy that India talks about and thrives on has been challenged by the illiteracy of the rural India, the kind of domination which is there of the elites, and a strong gender bias. Evidence shows that organic deliberation within the sabhas can be noisy, which means that it is filled with identity claims, emotional rhetorics, and demands for individual entitlements. So, the deliberations which go on, and as the word that we have used over here, get noisy, a lot of unnecessary deliberations and claims and rhetorics and demands try to fill up the deliberations which should have been otherwise. Another problem which has been faced is the discourse often reflects the existing patterns of social standing and hierarchy, with elites dominating discussion in less fractionalized villages and women remaining relatively silent even when they attend the meetings. So, this has been the irony of deliberative democracy. So, we have women, but the participation is hardly there, and they are merely acting as puppets in the hands of their male counterparts. So, even if they get elected, it is usually the men of the family who take charge of the entire governance, which is a major hurdle in the idea of deliberative democracy in rural India. The deepening of democracy via deliberation, however, has also faced meaningful limitations. Perhaps most obviously, the 73rd Amendment only applies to rural India, leaving urban India devoid of any mandated deliberative institutions. So, on the one side that we have said that India can really boast of this kind of deliberative democracy, however, this is something which has been confined only to the rural India, but India is getting urbanized rapidly, and we need this kind of a deliberation also to be happening in the urban India, which it clearly misses out on. Nevertheless, Gram Sabhas with all their warts provide an important example to the notion that deliberative institutions can help societies move forward with greater equality and agency and social inclusion. So, I would like to conclude here by this aspect, which says that it is important to note that the effectiveness of deliberative democracy principles can vary based on factors such as your civic education, the cultural norms of the society and the local governance structures. While deliberative democracy offers valuable insights for promoting participatory decision making, its successful implementation requires continuous efforts to ensure inclusivity, transparency and meaningful citizen engagement. So, if I had to quickly wrap up today's discussion, we started the understanding on deliberative democracy by a hypothetical case study, then we looked into the various criticisms which were there, and finally, we understood the Indian experiment on deliberative democracy. That is all for today. Thank you.